Welcome to part 2 of ethics. If you made it through part 1, you're to be congratulated. I know it's a little bit tedious and a little bit dry, but I think it's very important to understand the nature of good and evil. And if nothing else, it's important that I get my premises out there and my assumptions out there to be tested, because quite honestly, I'm tenacious. I'm not going to stop being a thorn in Alberta Health's side, and there's a couple ways you can stop me. One is to threaten me with my job. And another way that might be a little bit more ethical is to actually convince me that I'm wrong about these things. And I hope you can convince me that I'm wrong, because I really want to be enthusiastic about this takeover. And I could be a big help to you guys if you get me on your side here. So please pay attention to this and please correct me where I'm wrong. But you know what? If it turns out that I'm right and that you can't find a flaw in my arguments, then you might have to start admitting that this is an evil takeover. And if that's the case, then we need to work together to find ways of undermining the government in this. So let's examine this provincial takeover of ambulances from an ethical perspective. Just like any other provision of goods or services, ambulance services initially started with an entrepreneur who determined a demand for a particular service that a customer might find valuable, and provided that service in exchange for money. And that's how all goods and services start. It starts with an entrepreneur who has an idea, and of course goes from there. There's a demand right now, for example, for timely health care, and I've personally been waiting about 9 months to get a simple biopsy done. My daughter had to wait 8 weeks to get imaging done on her foot, and she's been hobbling around on crutches for 3 weeks. Yet I'm prevented by law from going to a physician and paying him money and getting my lump biopsied or getting my daughter's foot looked after. So let's be clear that prevented by law means prevented by threat of force, because any physician that looked after me or my daughter and we exchanged money would suffer a fine. He'd be in contravention of the law, and so he'd have his property stolen from him, or worse yet, he'd be imprisoned. He'd be kidnapped and put into a cage. As long as I've been in EMS, ambulance services have always been the responsibility of the municipality, for about the past 16 years or so. We now have a situation where big government is coming in and taking over from little government, taking what little autonomy municipalities had away from them. And instead of doing the ethical thing and going the other way, which would be to allow private services to compete on the open market against municipalities for the customer service, we see an increasing socialization of ambulance services, which means that those entrepreneurs or municipalities that wanted to provide a certain level of service or model of delivery for customers will be prevented from doing so. If a municipality went rogue and started operating an illegal ambulance service, or Joe's ambulance service came to town and started advertising their services, they'd be committing an illegal act, which is punishable through force, of course, fine, imprisonment, all these things, right? So on one hand, you have, a service being provided through mutually and voluntary consent between two parties, and on the other hand, you have the initiation of force. And it doesn't take a genius to see which is the worst of two evils. I mean, voluntary consent isn't evil at all. Initiation of force is. But and it takes an incredible amount of self-delusion to argue that initiation of force against Joe or against the municipality is more ethical than allowing Joe or the municipality to contract services freely with other individuals. But this is exactly what proponents of universal health care argue for. This is exactly what proponents of this provincial takeover argue for. And it's not a belief that is rooted in any kind of reality. Leftists, socialists, they argue here that somehow paying for a better service is immoral, that it creates tiers, as if there aren't already tiers, that it limits access for poor folk, and that it drives up costs. Well, in the next video, I'm going to argue that it does exactly the opposite. But the underlying premise detractors of so-called private healthcare have is that it is ethical for an individual or group of individuals to interfere with a private agreement that does not involve anybody else. And as I've proven in nauseating detail, this is an unethical position to hold. The underlying premise here is that government owns and controls physicians, and that the government's social engineers are in a better position to determine deployment of an individual physician's health care than the physician is himself. And this may or may not be true, but a more ethical way to approach it would be to say, look, I'm an expert at deploying your health services. You can contract to me and you'll get a lot more patients and you'll be more effective and everything else. And then of course the physician would love to have that service. But you can't force yourself on that. The other way that this whole takeover is unethical is that it is funded through the theft of money. It's redistribution of wealth. I mean, taxes are taken. They're not voluntary. You have to pay them, or you face fines or imprisonment. And that money is then goes to pay ambulance services. And I'm going to show in the next video how redistribution of wealth creates false signals in the market, and you end up with a completely inefficient, non-productive service overall. Now, during their visit, some of the Alberta Health Services bureaucrats made what I think are revealing false assumptions. For example, I asked them this question: if given a choice between acting ethically and acting legally, which would you choose? Now, the answer I got from one of them was essentially that there's a boundary between their business, which is public, and their ethics, which are personal. I guess I can be thankful that at least they understood that laws can be unethical. But I think that the answer revealed something important about the mind of a successful bureaucrat. To become successful in government, it seems you have to compartmentalize ethics from your work. In fact, the more you can convince yourself that the work you are doing is extremely important and highly virtuous, the further you can advance the government's cause and the better your chances of rising within the bureaucracy. Having access to rationally based systems of ethics, on the other hand, at these high levels, only becomes a handicap in the advancement of one's career. It literally pays to become more sociopathic as you advance through the system. Being able to isolate your ethics or your conscience and take it out of the equation is extremely beneficial in government. And I mean, we can see public intellectuals and universities, provide a great role here because they provide all sorts of sophisticated constructs like social contract theory and different things like that to allow the bureaucrat all sorts of justification to do what they do. So hopefully I've shown you that it's unethical to initiate force and interfere with the lives and property of other individuals. And you may say at this point, okay, all right, Tim, I get it. Government is unethical, but it is a necessary evil, right? I think Churchill said that. How else could something as important as healthcare be provided? We can't allow these greedy free marketeers to provide healthcare. They would just jack up prices, create a lousy product, chaos would ensue, and people would die. And this is basically the argument from pragmatism. And I'm going to argue in the next video that the exact opposite will occur under free market, and it's under government that chaos is produced, that lousy products are produced, that prices and costs skyrocket, and that people die. And so I hope you stay tuned for the next episode on pragmatism. Thank you.